Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jenna Davis, the Education Director with Minnesota Milk, and I'm really glad to see all of you taking the time out of your day to join us for today's webinar. Today, I'd like to welcome our speaker. We have our special guest, Keith Olander, and Keith is the Director of AgCentric, which is the Northern Center of Excellence in Agriculture for the Minnesota State University System. And one of his duties is to serve as the co-lead for the Minnesota Farm Business Management Program, which represents 8 different colleges, 2,700 farmer students, and 66 faculty members. And today he is going to be providing us with a really close look specific to dairy from reviewing the past and planning our future with some of the data from the 2019 annual report from Minnesota Farm Business Management. Before we turn it over here to Keith, I do just want to have one point of order throughout today's presentation. If you have any questions, please use the question box in the control panel of the GoToMeeting, and we will answer those questions as we are able. So without any further ado, Keith, I'll turn it over to you, and welcome.
All right, thank you, Jenna. I appreciate that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. As Jenna mentioned, I have the privilege of co-leading the Farm Business Management Program. And so really what we're going to spend 45 minutes talking about, a lot of numbers around the dairy finances on the farm, but really trying to look at it, what can we learn from these numbers to project us or propel us forward into the future. As we know, we're in some unique times here, and certainly the last 60 days, particularly more recent for dairy, has been a real challenge for that. We're going to reflect some of that, but at this point, as we sit here and look at futures prices and what CFAP has done as well as DMC, there's some bright lining or silver lining to the cloud out there. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just flop on forward and certainly send your questions in, and Jenna can relay those to me as we go forward for that. So one thing I've got that hopefully we can move is, let me click on the PowerPoint so I get it to move. There we go. So just as a reminder, I do co-lead with Brad Slesher, and I operate out of my office in Staples for the most part, and Brad is out of Mankato. And as Jenna outlined, there's 8 colleges involved, 66 faculty, nearly 3,000 farms for that. The particular survey we're in, about 2,200 farms submitted data for this particular piece moving forward. So let's move in, and you're going to see some different numbers in terms of different parameters with that. But this gives you a historical context. So we're looking at median net farm income. This is all farms, not just dairies in this particular slide. And what I'm trying to get you to think about is, let's assume that we all began farming in 2004. And if you were to draw that curvature, that line up here, so you start looking at where the trend line would lead us, it was pretty good up until 2012. And then as you fell off that cliff in 2012 and move into 2013, and now you're looking at 7 years of that median. And again, median is half below and half above. So if we look at our farms, and this is pretty representative of where we're at, that are falling in that median net farm income of that 40,000. This past year now we were about 33,000, give or take, or right around that $30,000 mark. But again, you've got that 7-year mark, and it's much different than the trajectory you were on if you began farming in 2004. So there's numbers of adjustments that are being made on the farm to fit with that. But as you look at net farm income, of course, the question becomes, what is that? What do you use net farm income for, right? So you got 2 columns here that you're looking at. The difference is that one of them adds depreciation in. Any business out there that's going to have assets, you're going to depreciate over a period of time. And you ultimately, as a farmer, you can not have depreciation, right? Obviously for taxes, there's a advantage to that, but what I'm getting at is I can just say, well, my depreciation costs, I'm just going to use them to live on this year, which is the right column. So then I end up at a negative 32,000, because you'll see here that we have to still take out of net farm income. I've got to take my family living, usually a Social Security or income tax, my healthcare expenses, which you're going to note here are 7,000, which is quite low for the average. as you move into this. And then you've got some kind of retirement and principal payments. So by the time I put all that together on either side, I'm negative. But let's go back to that depreciation number for a second. If I don't recognize depreciation, I don't have the ability to replace assets. And at some point along the way, when we go back to this previous slide of 7 years, and I'm using a TMR or a skid steer or some piece of equipment on the farm that's getting used every year, it has to be replaced. It just, either your repairs are going to eat you alive or you're going to end up just in an upgrade situation. So you have to recognize depreciation at some point, and you have to utilize it as a way to improve the farm, be it whatever is happening in the buildings, some part of the operation. So if you take a look at this number, and I'm going to use the right side, let's use the better of the two. Let's say that there's only a negative $32,000. The first question becomes, well, how do farmers make it then? The other side that I want you to recognize is this is a 7-year run. We expect in farms that, or in farming, we're going to have ups and downs. We're going to have loss years, we're going to have gain years. And if you go back to that original slide, so you look at in 2012 was a big gain year. But when you have 7 years where you're now running a negative, and it's pretty consistent that we're somewhere around this negative $30,000, the only way that they come up with an alternative here now is to go off farm and get that. And I'm going to show you that that off farm income is filling that gap. So what we've created in the average farm situation in Minnesota is that you can farm and that's fine, but there better be outside income coming in to subsidize the farm. Not that that's certainly a great way to be by any stretch, but that's really the reality of what's there. But I think it's important as we talk about net farm, that you still have to worry about family living and we still have to worry about principal payments. Those are the two majors. The other thing I'll say about healthcare in there is we're not capturing if a spouse works off farm and has that benefit, that number is not captured here provided. The other side is if there's any kind of assistance that's coming into the family from a state side or medical assistance side that's playing that number down. Because we know reality is somewhere between $18,000 and $28,000 a year is what that medical expense is costing to be able to cover those pieces of that. So that's, you want to kind of keep that in mind as you're looking at this average number and saying, yeah, that's kind of low for that. Another place I want to look is, this is in net worth, right? And any business out there, you basically, you're either going to need to be growing or retraction, right? I mean, those are your two options out there. I get really concerned when I look at this chart, and particularly if you go from 16 to 19, there is little to no growth in net worth on our farms. They really have stagnated. And that, the longer that goes, the more difficult it gets for performance and getting moving on, because you just start shrinking away your net worth base. Particularly if you start looking at the average age of the farmer in the nation is 58 years old. And if I'm 58 and my net worth is stagnated, that's concerning over time, because reality says inflation is eating me. Even if I just take a 2 to 3 or 4% inflation rate, I'm going backwards in reality as we look to this. So it just is another indicator of how that fits for that. The other thing I'm going to share with you, when you see this northern Minnesota piece, I want you to kind of in your mind's eye look at or think about Minnesota, and I'm dividing it really by I-94. So if I head from the Twin Cities to Fargo, I consider anything north of that line as northern Minnesota and anything south of that line as southern Minnesota. So this one, and when you see northern Minnesota, again, pretty representative of the state, but you're seeing that those assets or net worth is pretty well frozen. Now I'm going to turn to southern Minnesota, but I'm going to look at a different thing. I'm going to say my return on assets, or what is my return on investment, right? But we're going to specifically on assets here. Again, kind of giving you a historical context. If you want a good rate of return, typically we think of about 8% as a nice rate of return. In other words, there's business growth that's going on. Well, the reality says in these last 7 years, you look at that line down there and you're somewhere around that 2% maybe that you're seeing that. In that, 19 was a little stronger at 3.4% rate of return. Now, when we were in 10, 11, and 12, certainly those were great return years, and there was business growth. It was capturing it. So again, as I go back to thinking about putting yourself 7 years where I'm really not, almost hardly even growing, I'm hardly even getting a return on assets. So that begins to start the questions of why am I doing what I'm doing, right? And you really got to dig into your core values as a farmer, particularly in dairy, to say, why am I doing this? And then the other side of that is you determine the reason why, and your management moves into a micromanagement mode. That's just imperative that you've got to manage finances to the T. The challenge we have within all of this is to connect to the consumer and have the consumer understand the financial pressures that this farmer is under or the farm family is under. Because then that's the other key components we think forward here. Yes, it's a farmer and we think of this owner operator making the decision, but there's a family usually a part of this. And so there's just that pressure and the fallout that's against that. But a key component that we think about where the finances are at and how that relates to the consumer. Let's go a little different place now and let's look at family living and personal spending. I'm not sure that this would be of a surprise to anybody that we're going to find. If you look at the state where the average is, it's somewhere around that upper 40s to about 50,000. The one thing you realize here very quickly is that a family living has been very, very small. That's about a 5% increase over 5 years, or 1% per year. The fact of the matter is everything that family is buying to live has increased dramatically in that time, probably at a rate of 3+%. And of course, if we move to healthcare, it's even more than that. So somewhere in their family budget, they are making significant adjustments to keep that family living at bay to be able to do that. And then of course, as you look to other living and investment, there's family vehicles and other things that are in there that raises that number up. But it's really that cash family living that's really a critical piece to that. Now I went earlier and said, how do we make up that gap, right, of that $30,000? Well, if we look at what non-farm income is doing, certainly we're on the increase, right, in terms of what's been going on with that. And again, if you look at on the first slide, the negative 32,000, you'll see very quickly that it's being made up right here. So as you look to what we think of a traditional farmer almost is right now, in terms of if we could describe the demographic, there's really this place where I need to account for my family living, and or at least most of my family living is going to come from off-farm sources. And this is a variety of different things. Maybe it's a seed dealership they're operating, or they're trucking, or the spouse actually has a position in town. But there's somehow that's become part of the farm life, is to have that. Again, I think of this as, why is this important? It's just really critical as we particularly communicate with legislators in terms of what that family life looks like, and is the policies they guide and move forward, and to where the consumer is at in terms of what the product they're taking off the shelf and the sweat equity that's really invested in terms of what's going on there. So this is a northern Minnesota look, and this is a southern Minnesota look. Really you're looking just at, again, the timelines. It's a little higher in south of 94, where you're just over $40,000 in terms of what's there from off-farm income moving forward. But it does give you that perspective. And again, as I look to the demographic, what we're describing as a farmer, that's there. So what I've shared to this point has been pretty general to just farms in general. Now I'm going to turn my attention to dairy very specifically. And we're going to look at some different things. This is statewide data. We're going to look by herd size, and we're going to look different by profitability going forward with that. So kind of pay attention to, and I'll try to my best to point out the differences as you look to this, because there is some interesting things that you want to pay attention to when it comes to herd size going forward. I want to come back here just a second. There we go. The question comes up on organic. I do have some organic slides on the backside, but all of the data prior to that we're going to look at does not include organic. And for those of you who are not experienced in that world, organic has a much higher cost of production, but it has a much higher pay rate on that milk. And so it will throw the numbers if you're not following that. So this probably is not a surprise to anybody watching it that understands dairy at this point. The herd size, this is average, just continues to increase. And as you know, as the profitability per cow becomes less and less, the farm family looks at how do we do more, how do we rotate cows, try to minimize any capital investment and expenses as far as adding on to any facility, but just certainly trying to draw that herd size up. So this one is production per cow. Interestingly enough, we saw it really has been on the rise. We saw back in 09 a slight slip, but really we had moved up to 2017 where we were averaging across the state 25,000 pounds per cow. Now, the one thing for historical context, I milked cows when I grew up, and if we got 18,000, man, we were tickled. We thought that was great. And so what I'm driving at here is we've got a great story to tell about cow comfort and how do we take care of that cow and help her to really maximize production, right? And this is a great story to tell because you do not get this kind of production out of cows that are not well taken care of. And so from an animal welfare standpoint, I think that's a great story to tell. The other thing some of you are paying attention to now, you're saying, well, in 18 and 19, we fell off a little bit. Well, my experience when we're working on farm business management, feed is undoubtedly one of the key drivers in dollars and expenditures in a dairy operation. And it's always tempting to go down that road to say, boy, we really should trim that back by a few percent. And so that's what happens. Unfortunately, when you start driving back that feed bill, it does show up in production out there. And so as we watch that, really that cash flow get really tight, as we've watched in 18 and 19, you're seeing just that reflection there. Not significant, but it's drawing down production a little bit. And I'm not saying that that's the only driver or cause for that. There could be other instances out there, but that's one that I've experienced and seen as we move forward. So now we're going to compare the milk per cow, but now I want to look at what is the return per cow. Again, my experience tells us that somewhere around $500 a cow is a pretty decent place to be. That typically allows families to live in a situation where they can pay for that depreciation. They're not becoming wealthy by any stretch. So as you look to that, and I say that number, you'll identify very quickly that there's only 2 years in here that we've reached that. Now, obviously 14 was a banner year, right? There was some great things that went on there. But by and large, if you try to run a trend line across there, you're finding well below that $500 per cow. In fact, to the point, 18 was really a difficult year because for every cow, there was a loss situation that occurred to be able to do that. Thankfully, 19 was more positive in that in terms of what the returns were. So this is 10 through 19, and now I'm going to bring us a little more historical context to these numbers. And let's go back to 2000. The one thing I want you to see is if you could take 09 and draw a line vertically on this chart and look behind 09 or prior to 09, notice where that average number is. It is very close to that $500 per cow return. And even as if I could go previously in history, we were pretty close to that. We also found that there was less volatility prior to 09. Granted, it moves up and down every year, and that's fine, but we don't have the shocks that occurred from 09 forward. If you start to look at the volatility and also the depressed income, if I can say it that way, from 09 forward, there's two different trend lines occurring here, and 09 kind of is the divide between that. That's significant when you think of across the industry and what we're seeing in the industry today from a profitability standpoint, and our data just tends to prove that out. But it also, from a new producer perspective, you are in a new normal. I mean, that's really, I think we're all talking about new normals with COVID, but when you think of new normals, there was a new normal that came out of 09. Whether it was intended or not, it's there. And so your return per cow is much different than what you were experiencing prior to 09. So I think it's a very interesting piece as you look to that and study that going forward. The other piece, again, this is per hundredweight of milk, and in terms of what's there, just in seeing the profitability out there in terms of what pay price was, and I'm going to bring that up in just a second, but you're going to see here, it's a different perspective to look on the numbers that's out there for that. Obviously, if you're not familiar, milk is sold by the hundredweight, so you're getting 12 plus gallons in that hundredweight that's there, but this is what the farmer's piece of that is. Moving forward. This is a look at pay price, what we've seen over time. And this is again averaging out the years that's there. We find that if we could hang somewhere around that $19, $19.50 a hundredweight right now, what that does for the farmer is it allows them to basically come back to zero at the end of the year. And that would include that depreciation piece, so they could actually do some upgrade of machinery. And again, so you look at that 15, certainly through 18 were negative years. 19 is a little closer for that. Now we're going to take a little different approach to this, and this is going to break down some of the different costs, and then we're going to start getting into this herd size piece of what's out there. So we're going to look at these pieces here. We've got the feed cost, the direct cost, directs and overhead, and then what I call gross margin. And I'll talk a little through what each of these are. The other side is we have the average of all of these, and then you've got that middle range. And when we talk about high in this sense, high regards to the most efficient that's there. So in feed cost per hundredweight, and that's how we're going to go forward in terms of talking about dollars here, is per hundredweight, really breaking it down. So the average is about 8.25, and the most efficient we're at 7.75. Direct cost gets into beyond feed. You look at veterinary, you're going to see additional costs around the farm that are built into that, that take that enterprise directly forward. Then you're going to mix in overhead, so you have interest, you've got utilities that come in for that. Labor is incorporated in this now, and you'll see where your costs are for that going in. And then you're looking at what the gross margins are. Now you got a lot of things that just popped up. So gross margin, you got to keep in mind, is all sales. So you have a fluid milk sale. You have usually they're going to sell bull cows, cull cows, but then you've also got a cost of replacements that are factored into this number as well going forward. But in 19, your net returns there come out. The difference you need to really pay attention to is what the high folks did, the high 20%, compared to what the average was. Almost, not quite double, but you're getting close up there for that. Then we've got this labor and management charge that comes in. And the one thing, farmers, they work a lot of hours, but they don't never take necessarily a direct payout of that. So in our database, we factor in what would a farmer's cost would be from a management standpoint that they're contributing to the operation, but not necessarily getting paid for. But it still nets out positive, even when we put that labor and management charge in there going forward. This is a 3-year look. So it's the same chart, but now we look at the 3 different years instead of just the different parts of the group going forward. So basically you're seeing your feed costs rise in this 3-year time frame. You're also seeing that your direct costs are rising, again, directs and overhead, and then our margin there, as you can see. And this is reflective of one of the earlier charts I shared with you moving forward. But it does give you the sense, certainly, that 19 out, if you were to pick the years, was certainly the better. But keep in mind, we've got a negative to make up for in 18. And that, when they're doing the negative, and of course you understand that, you're trying to borrow money to get yourself through. So then we've got to not only pay that money back from 18, but we've got to pay that interest. So sometimes the positives the year after aren't as positive as what we can make them seem on paper for that. This is a different way to look at it, but this is a net return piece. So now you're looking at that little blue line up on the front, and this is the same 209 number I shared on one of the earlier slides. Just looking at the 3 years and what the comparison is. Most of you, when you're doing your credit lines, you're looking at what's the 3-year trend, and that's what you're trying to set it at. I know when we start new and beginning farmers, you're looking at a 3-year trend. And so these are some of the numbers that are being used, and of course you can take this additionally and break it out per county or region going forward as well. So now let's take a little shift again, and let's look at size of herd. And then there's a note there that just says that we still are not including organics in this. This is some important data just about our herds that are in here. So this particular data set, now the immediate one I'm talking about is 283 herds in there. And this is what they're comprised of. There's 26 herds that are less than 50 cows, very small number, 75, then 50 to 186, and you see from there. Also, there's only 28 herds over 500. But let's take this a step forward and bring that number in. So now you're looking at what the numbers of herds are in Minnesota in each of those categories. And this sideline chart here shows how we in FBM comprise of the total, if that makes sense. And the reason that this is significant is when you're looking at 25+% of the herds are in Minnesota are in the FBM program, that is significant data to guide policy, legislation, decision making, and benchmarking for your own farms. Now, I wouldn't necessarily do that if I were less than 50 cow herd, but we're seeing those numbers, of course, are quite small and just continue, unfortunately, to be pressed out unless they're subsidized by off-farm income. But that's really what I want you to take away when you look at the data and what's there. When we have 100 cows or more in the herd, there's a significant number of those within the program. So going forward now, looking at this on a per herd or per size basis, you're looking at on the left side now is the smaller herd up to 50 cows, and on the right side are the over 500s, and you see everything in. So the first line you see there is pounds of milk average per cow. And the one thing you're noting is the larger herds are certainly figuring out the best management and best cow comfort for production in that. And this is a significant shift. If we were to back up prior to 09, that was inverted. Most of the time we found the 100 or 75 cow herds were some of the best managed and most production. So just a difference there that you see that, and that's one driver that's a little different than what we saw 20 years ago. But to be able to manage large cow herds now has become very common and really not perfected, but they're getting closer to doing it very well. The red line is simply just what is the average within each of those groups. So you're seeing there in the large group, almost 900 is the average moving into that. All right, so now let's go back to this style chart per hundredweight, but now let's compare them by herd sizes. And you each, as you have your herd size, can plug in accordingly to what's there. So the first thing we see, obviously, in feed costs, that the large herds are not necessarily the cheapest, but pretty close. Whereas you have $9.19 spent on less than 50 cows, and then you're down at that 200 to 500 cow herd is running $8.12, but 4 cents higher at the larger. So you're seeing an efficiency in feed as you move into those. You look as you move into direct overhead, combined costs here per hundredweight, and what's moving in there. Again, not the cheapest, but you're seeing some pretty good pieces there. But let's go a step further, because labor has to be factored in as to how we do that. And that's where you begin to see when total costs come into play, the larger herds are the cheapest or most efficient when doing that. And so I remember presenting to Minnesota Milk here, I think it was about 2 years ago, and I remember a gentleman in the audience said, well, if I'm going to be in business, then I have to compete at that level. And there's some truth to that, that really that I've got to, if I'm going to truly be competitive, I've got to figure out how do I do that for 1608 a hundredweight. And you're back there now, but you've had 60 days where you've been well below that number of that 1600 or $16 a hundredweight for that when we go in. And then, of course, as you look to margin on the other side, so remember, gross margin is where we take everything that they make, take out that replacement cost, that heifer replacement cost, and we come in, and then you're seeing the positives as you go forward with that. And so your average cost in this case is $17.65, and that's driven down pretty good in terms of where I was at. I originally make the statement, and I still would come back to that statement, we'd like to see if we could keep a consistent income somewhere around $19 a hundredweight, brings in a fair amount of profitability. Because keep in mind at this point, anything less than 100 cows is really either very tight or losing money. And so we need to draw that price up, particularly as we move into smaller herds. All right, this is a different take. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's important to note on term debt coverage. So for those of you not necessarily experienced in this world, from a lender perspective, for every dollar of debt, you need to have a dollar of cash available to pay that. That's pretty simple. Preferably, we're at $1.20 or more, so it allows for margin, right? And you can see by the green that moves up, we're at $1.50 or better, and we were there. That is not common when you average everything out. But if you start looking at where the numbers are at in terms of ranges, the larger we're certainly there going forward. So, you know, it's not that one size fits all, but it's just where the term debt coverage. And you can say, well, in the smaller herds, what's going on there, or how do we do that? And again, I would bring you back to family living. Remember, we've got to pull those term debt payments out, and that's where that's coming from as we go forward. Here's a little different look. This is net worth. Again, looking across the state. So the net worth change, you find significantly more in larger herds. The one thing you got to be careful of, you've got an average net worth of 1.4 million. You obviously have larger net worth gains or net worth amounts as you move into larger herds for that. The one thing I will say is that it has been positive going forward. I did share with you that one chart where it's relatively flat when I put all farms in here, but dairy certainly, as we looked to last year, we had some positive net worth as we move forward, and it's imperative that they grow in that sense. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is going to be recorded. There's a lot of data here. It just takes a different perspective and gives you the actual numbers I've been sharing in each of the herd sizes for that. The one thing, you can look at milk price per hundredweight approximately in the middle of the chart, and you should pay attention to that because that's a quality factor. The average was 1864. The larger herds had 1907. Maybe that's a other pieces besides quality, because there's a quantity piece in there. But it just is interesting as you look to all the numbers that's there going forward. And of course, as we look to up to 50 cows or less than 50 cows, there's some challenges there. This is a different set of data again. I'm going to start mixing you up a little bit here, but you're looking at all herds. Now, in this data set, there's 299. We brought them all together in this one. And you look at a lot of different factors, but then across the categories are robotics. Then you've got non-robotic, what we consider traditional. You got non-robotic 3 times a day. You got organics. And then there's a program called the Dairy Initiatives, which is a special MDA program that works with our Farm Business Management Program to assist dairy producers in managing their operations and really overcoming obstacles. You would probably pay attention to the blue column where you'd have a net return, and you're seeing some differences as you move across there. One significant change, and I'm going to point that out in just a minute, organic is significantly down. It is nice that they're all positive, but again, there's a lot of data here, and I'm going to let you study this kind of on your own time as we go forward for that. Okay, so now I need you to shift your hat a little bit again, and we are looking at organics. Again, a historical context in terms of net return per cow that's out there, and we're going to show you, if you're not aware, yes, you make more per hundredweight, but there is a whole lot more invested in that hundredweight as we go forward. But organics really have had some pretty good years from 14 forward, and I'm not going to get into all of it, but there's a lot of market situations that are driving that currently. And so the door to be open for new organics is limited right now, and I'm not sure the exact status. I know we've had just some challenges bringing new producers into that, but they right now are seeing or did see some of the lowest margins in our data set, as you can see at $108. Their pay price fairly consistent, and you can see it is much, much higher. But I'm going to show you in feed costs that it also comes into play, but it's something that is certainly attributable, and if they have the ability to be able to do that. The herd size in organics is roughly that 100. Last year was 101. You'll see there it's grown from over the time, but they are typically in that smaller data set as I showed you. We don't have a lot of large, in fact, very few large organics that are out there. This is one thing that is very important to notice, though, is that the pounds per cow in this is significantly lower. So remember, I shared with you they were roughly about 24,000 on conventional. Here we were at 14,000. They're almost 10,000 pounds less, and there was a slight drop back. Now organics can be a little different. It can be feed. It can also be feed quality, because keep in mind organics are required to graze, and so sometimes grass quality can drive this as well. But typically it's been that organics, if they can hang in this range of 15,000 pounds with a pay price of $30, it's just a matter if they've got feed availability, and I'm talking about hay, organic corn, then things there tend to cash flow. But we are seeing that did tighten up significantly, and we'll watch what happens this year going forward. Okay, so I'm coming down here. I've got about 6-8 minutes left, and I know we'll probably have some questions here. I'd encourage you to send those in if you've got any or discussion points that are out there. But a few things I want to just turn my attention to. I've got a few people I know that are on specifically to HASP, or the Headwaters Ag Sustainability Partnership, and working with them. And so FBM, we are very concentrated on business management and economic benchmarking with farms, which is critical. But we've also started looking at what if you had an environmental cohort, and what does that look like if it's any different? So for the first time this year, we partnered with MDA on their water quality certification, and we were able to pull out 53 farms out of the database, which is a nice set to start with. And a lot of them are dairies and focused in that area. This report I'm going to show you is on our website, and I encourage you to go investigate it. But one of the things we'll do going forward is different environmental cohorts and what that looks like. And I know some of you, this comes in different ways to your ears in terms of whether you like it or don't like it. The fact of the matter is our consumers demand more and more of that transparency of food source. And so however we can demonstrate environmental sustainability along with our economic viability is critical. And this report starts to go down that road. There's data in here that it's published, it's 1 year data. So what I'm getting at is I really am, this cohort, if you look at it, looks really good. Well, when you have any 1 year, when you look at it, it can look really good or really bad. I'm going to be more excited about this as we get into 3 years and beyond, because we'll be able to trend it. But these 53 farms, for whatever reason, really shine financially that are in there. And if you look at the report more on the website, you're going to see that they have a fair concentration to that central Minnesota belt, obviously where dairy is concentrated, but they're spread out throughout the state. So the interesting question will be, if they continue to be strong financially in the 3 year trend, is there a correlation between environmental practice and economic practice? I don't know that. It's just a curiosity I have, and to see where we go with that. But I really want you to think about what's out there for that and what the possibilities are. Again, I'm not saying that that's all favorable. I just know from a consumer perspective, and I know that the co-ops, particularly in the dairy side, we are going to have to do more and more to certify that we are doing best management practices environmentally. We all do that, but it's just been accepted practice. Now we've got to document that in some way that assures that consumer who hasn't been on a farm now for 3 to 4 generations that those practices are occurring. And the other side that I mentioned earlier from an environmental perspective that we all need to tell as farmers and affiliates to the industry is that cow, because she is so well taken care of, is doing wonderful in production in doing that. And I know that from a dairy farmer myself coming out of that, but I also know that that's not always assumed by the consumer. And so to explain that through, sometimes they feel like you're exploiting the cow to get that production. The reality is, we know if we were to do that, that's a short-lived cow, and that's not the way we grow cattle. So those are some interesting components I think we got to continue the discussion on, that we complement our financial data with. What does it look like? And I got at the top there that environmental sustainability and financial viability. Because the other side of this is, if we cannot get the farmer viable, it doesn't matter what else, because I know at the heart of the farmer is they want to put the food on the table for their own family, and then they're going to take care of all that environment around them. And those two run a tricky balance, but that's really where we're at. And I think my data today probably demonstrates how difficult financially it is going forward. That being said, as I started, and I want to come back to that, we know that CFAP brought a little bit of a bridge gap funding that dairy farmers can take advantage of, and I know that that's helping some. I also know that DMC is available and going to bring out payment. I believe March was going to start those. But the ultimate is that we have market, and futures are showing some positive signs. So my hope is that we would see 2020 in the end come back to a positive spot. And it's really, at this stage, when I sit there, I don't even know how to guess based upon what I've seen in pay price. I've heard pay prices in that $10, $11 range as we bottomed out in that April. And now where do we come back to if we get 20 plus? So just a guessing game. So Jenna, as I come to kind of a close, and again, if we've got questions that are out there, these are the reports that are all on the website, and I encourage you to go there. And there's special sorts. There's a special dairy sort as well. And then I know that you're going to be taping this and providing it. The goal was just to really look at where's our history at, And the one thing, if you're a farmer on here, I'm just strongly going to encourage you, whether it's through FBM or whatever your means are, you need to be benchmarking. And I'll go to kind of my takeaways here. That micromanage of financials, cost of production, to know that is more critical now than ever. Just in the times we're in, the volatilities I demonstrated certainly in the last decade, but if we just look in the last 60 days, the volatility has been unbelievable. And that's what I mean by benchmark. How do you rank? If you're, running within the pack, so to speak, that's one thing. If you can be to the positive side of the pack, that's even better. But it does not, to know your numbers is one thing, but to know how they rank up against your region, your county, or your state, I think is another very important piece to that. And of course, that written plan is always the one we struggle with. I'm guilty of this often, as we have great ideas and they stay in our head and they need to go down on paper. And I guess, as I pointed out, volatility seems to be our new normal. And I'm not just saying that from COVID. I shared with you that one particular slide of what we've watched since 2009 to be able to do that. And then ultimately, you need to clearly define why you do what you do. Because at the end of the day, when the battle is hard and the sweat is falling and the rain is not coming, or whatever is going on in life, I think as families, I have a crop farm now. I don't have dairy, but I think farming is a wonderful tool by which you raise families on. And I hope that a lot of you have found that joy in that as well. But that's one of the ways you can define why you do what you do. But that's critical when you move through volatility, because there's got to be some sense of certainty that you clamp onto with that. So with that, I think that we were supposed to be wrapping up here in a couple minutes. Jenna, do you have any questions that we should be talking about, or is there comments?
We do. We have a couple of questions that came through the chat box. The first one you kind of touched on, but I'll see if you want to elaborate. But from a lender perspective or farm business management instructor perspective, milk price has risen over the last 3 months. What price per hundredweight should we use going forward for the next 6 months for a cash flow?
Well, our rule of thumb always is that we use what the Farm Service Agency published price is. Off the top of my head, I apologize, I do not know what that is. And I have one of the FBM faculty, I know they're on there, they could put that in quick. They know that, they usually carry that in their memory, but that's what I would do. And if you need that specifically, I can certainly publish that for you. But that's what we always go back to, is what Farm Service Agency comes out, because they use some USDA modeling for that. And I know, in April, that seemed like a joke because it was a very positive price compared to what cash was. But that's always the benchmark that we do. And then in some cases, we can add a premium based on what your herd performance is like.
All right, thanks, Keith. I appreciate that. And also, if any of the farm business management instructors do know that number off the top of their head, feel free to put that in the question box or the chat box as well. The next question we have, what is the driving factor of growth in assets?
Well, when you look at, if you break it down financially, it's the whole idea of, we don't take land prices, it jumps up 1 year really high. We keep a consistency with our land price, because that's a major asset for most farmers, is what that land is and their buildings. So you're looking at what their tax slips are reviewing and how market prices are going. But the other side of that is, what is the debt we're accumulating or eliminating throughout the year, right? As profitability comes, we would hope or expect that the operating debts would decline and that we would be paying off loans. So the trick would be, is you're heading towards your retirement, that we get to a debt-free situation, so that you're always driving down debt every year. And then as we grow net worth, that means that we're maintaining whatever assets we have. So the machinery line we're replacing on a regular basis, so we're always growing value in the machinery. The herd size would be the same way, that we would maintain herd size. And of course, the land will typically grow on its own, as long as we don't keep moving debt down the balance sheet. So hopefully that answers the question, but it's the idea that we maintain and grow our asset base, but the real big component is that we don't let debt get out of control, and that keeps that net worth growing.
Very good. And a reminder to everyone else still on the line, if you do have a question, please type it in that question box. The next question we have is, This started with a conversation about market facilitation payments and government subsidies. Can you talk about where these show up in the net farm income conversation and how much of a role they've recently played?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I've gotten a lot of questions on that. I think even there was a report out that said this year it's going to be like 37% of net farm income. So if you go back to my first slide and let's just take that $30,000 number, right? That's net farm income. Most businesses or farms on our average database is running about $800,000 a year. That's their gross. But when you break it down to net, what's left over, and you take government payments, it is truly possible that we're going to see $10,000 to $17,000 average per farm this year, which is significant when it's net farm. When it comes to the gross of the 800,000, very insignificant. We expect that, and I'm just saying it's kind of in the FBM world, the farm business, the payments that are going to come in this year are going to be significant. There's no doubt about that. COVID has driven something at us we never expected or saw ever, which then in turn also triggered DMC, which is going to drive more of those in. So we've got to be careful in messaging. Net farm income is what's left over afterwards. And if you're going to use that as a percentage, yes, it's very large in that. But when we consider a gross farm of $800,000, then you kind of put that number in perspective. And so that's something for all of us to message accordingly. As far as where the future is going, I can't even question on that. I do know that, there's certainly possibilities for additional I don't know if it'd be MFP or another CFAP. There's another 20% that's being held. We don't know whether we're going to get that, but I'm not going to be able to venture a guess on that. But I do think, Jenna, the question on the net farm income and the percentage that we're hearing on the media side, we as farmers and those affiliated with the farm need to really be quick to step up and say, we got to look at net farm income and what that means for that. And in some cases, that's the profitability the farm has. That's literally buying food for the table right now.
Very good. And we have one last question. And what is the standard deviation for What's the standard deviation for net income per hundredweight between the different farm sizes?
Oh, that's a good question, Jenna. I don't have that off the top of my head because I think
would it be in the report? I've got my handy dandy.
That would be the quickest way, is go into the reports and then you can see more detail than either the special source or the annual report. It's a great question on what that is, but without digging into it, and again, it's not off the top of my head, but sure. I certainly appreciate the detail behind that question.
Absolutely. And I think we'll wait a few more seconds if anyone else has a final burning question. But in the meantime, Keith, I think you did a fantastic job explaining where we've been, not only in 2019, but previously. And I think the one thing that we're all getting used to in agriculture specifically, you said it several times, that V word, volatility. It's there and it's here to stay. But I'm glad that we have the historical data in that context to really kind of help understand why that's the case, and it can help us as producers and farm business management instructors, lenders, help us make decisions to get where we want to go. And I think the other thing you really hit home on that I took away was, what's your why? Start with your why and things fall into place. I really, truly believe that. And I'm not seeing any other questions. So thank you very much for your time today. And as a reminder, we will post this recording as well as a link to some of the follow-up documents that Keith kind of related to. And if you have anything else, please let us know. But again, we appreciate your time, Keith.
All right. Thank you very much, Jenna.
All right. Have a great day, everybody.